Members of a government operations subcommittee gathered this past Tuesday to consider legislation concerning the release of documents which relate to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Several witnesses testified at Tuesday's hearing, including film director Oliver Stone, whose recent movie, JFK, has rekindled public interest in the Kennedy assassination.
Welcome, Mr. Stone. We have your prepared statement. You are probably the reason that we're all here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a prepared statement, which you have for the record, which I may vary from slightly. I may improvise, as directors sometimes do, as I read. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, my name is Oliver Stone, and I assure you it is with pleasure and some pride that I appear before this subcommittee today to urge the passage of House Joint Resolution 454, quote, to provide for the expeditious disclosure of records relevant to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. I am proud to be here, Mr. Chairman, because I think it is reasonable to suggest that my most recent work, the motion picture JFK, may, in its reception by the American people, have played some role in creating the state of public opinion from which House Joint Resolution 454 has emerged. The murder of President John F. Kennedy remains, after nearly 30 years, the crime of the century. And for the overwhelming majority of Americans, it is the unsolved crime of the century. A hastily assembled commission of wise men, chaired by the Chief Justice of the United States and is consisting entirely of government insiders, was assembled shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy to study the evidence and offer public opinion a verdict Americans would find acceptable. That verdict, that President Kennedy was killed by a lone, deranged communist gunman who was himself killed 2 days later while in police custody by another lone, deranged gunman, seemed incredible when published and has proved more so with each passing year. Most Americans did not believe or support the verdict of the Warren Commission initially, and now more than 3 in 4, according to all recent samplings of public opinion, think some conspiracy was involved. The Warren Commission, concerned as it was only with who and how, never answered, never attempted to answer the question of why John F. Kennedy was killed. Obvious connections, Lee Harvey Oswald's to intelligence organizations and individuals, Jack Ruby's to organized crime, were uninvestigated and unexamined. And so from day one, the mainstream media of the United States, our major newspapers, magazines, networks, reporters, columnists, and correspondents accepted the official verdict and never began, let alone pursued, an investigation. Hard as it is to believe the crime of the century, in which the preliminary verdict was widely disbelieved and discredited, was never seriously investigated by any major journalist or journalistic organization in America, even those priding themselves on their existence as, quote, newspapers of record or centers of investigative journalism. And thus, the official media joined official government in a decision to stonewall the American people, partly through lethargy, and in part, an important part, to protect their own record of inaction and bland acceptance of the unacceptable. And so, Mr. Chairman, when Warner Brothers wholeheartedly supported, against urgings by those very media defenders of orthodoxy and silence, to suppress my film, The Making of JFK, Americans finally confronted on the screen the fact that most of the records which could have yielded a different verdict, CIA, FBI, military and naval intelligence, the files of the investigation by this body's Select Committee on Investigations, all these were sealed from public view for 50 years. So it was no surprise a movement began in this House, in the Senate, and in public to open those files to permit us to try to find out the truth we had so long been denied. What were Lee Oswald's connections to American intelligence agencies, the CIA, the FBI, Army Intelligence, and the Office of Naval Intelligence? How was he permitted to re-enter the United States when he had renounced his citizenship, in his own words, to give secrets to the Soviet Union? How was he able, on almost no notice, to leave the Marines on a trumped-up excuse, to go to the Soviet Union almost immediately? What were his connections with CIA-involved White Russians in Dallas, or the anti-radicals in New Orleans like Guy Bannister, David Ferry, and Clay Shaw? Why did he distribute obviously bogus pro-Castro leaflets while headquartered in the same office in New Orleans as militant anti-communist ex-intelligence officers? How did he get the job in the book depository overlooking the very precise point in the motorcade where President Kennedy's car had to slow down to 11 miles an hour? How did he get the job only several weeks before? What kind of coincidence was that? How did Lee Oswald get the rifle under the alias Lee Heidel when he could have bought a rifle in any gun store in Texas without having a trace on it? Just what were Jack Ruby's ties to organized crime? And how could he, Jack Ruby, a private citizen known as a small-time hoodlum, enter the Dallas police station armed and confront and shoot without hindrance the guarded and manacled man accused of the most publicized crime in our history? And finally, why was President Kennedy killed? Since it has been established from other evidence that he was indeed embarked upon a course to change our foreign policy with respect to the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the nations of Southeast Asia, including a decision on paper to withdraw our advisors and send no combat troops into the military and moral quagmire of Vietnam, was this the reason? Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, the files which are the object of House Joint Resolution 454 will yield some or all of these answers. Perhaps not. But without this resolution, we shall never know. And in a free society, that is intolerable. The stone wall must come down. Now, I am aware, Mr. Chairman, the resolution will be criticized. Legal hair-splitting by the Department of Justice and the Office of Management and Budget, part of arcane battles which really concern the propriety of the special prosecutor rules, may impede passage. The actual language of the resolution may have been drafted as too complex, but none of those objections can have a lot of weight with those millions of Americans, 15, 17 million Americans, who saw JFK in movie theaters, and millions more, maybe another 20 or 30 million, who will see it at home on video cassette and on television, nearly all of whom are determined 50 years shall not pass before we can pierce the media's silence and learn the truth for ourselves. The people have spoken loudly and clearly. The agencies who have stonewalled for decades may invoke that catchphrase of obstructionists and hiders of the truth, the magic words, national security. But, Mr. Chairman, our enemy lies in ruins, and the danger some Soviet agent may learn something embarrassing to the CIA or naval intelligence is no longer important, if it ever was. It is only important to those who may be hiding something. Perhaps a handful of living people whose names are in these records may need protection for reasons of privacy. But that can be easily accomplished, and those names, if any, can be easily edited. Mr. Chairman, don't let the existence of thousands of pages of documents deter you from the course of openness and candor you have so strongly set. The technology exists to review those files swiftly and fully. If the task is undertaken by people who want the files open, it will be done quickly. If by those who want them to remain concealed, then lawyers can be found, petty arguments can be interposed, and journalists can be prompted to support those arguments to keep them sealed for another 50 years. I believe this is an idea whose time has come. Americans will support you as you move forward. I don't think I had the time in the 3-hour and 8-minute movie to go into a biography of Jim Garrison. The movie dealt with 4 storylines: Garrison's investigation in New Orleans, the reconstruction of the event in Dealey Plaza, Mr. Oswald's background, and the military-industrial theme that we introduced with the character name X, based on Colonel Fletcher Prouty. So I had 4 themes, and I had little time to dwell into some of the flaws and defects of Mr. Garrison's investigation, including many of the wrong turns that he took. But I admire Jim Garrison. I've met him, spent time with him. I think he is a great American who has been much maligned. I think he's been libeled as equally as Lee Oswald has been libeled in this matter. Mr. Garrison succeeded in bringing 3 things to light. He liberated the Zapruder film by subpoenaing Time Life and getting the film shown for the first time to the American public. Bootleg copies were made of that film. And I think the Zapruder film is the best smoking gun we have. Mr. Garrison also clearly showed the connections that Lee Oswald had to anti-communists in Dallas with George de Mohrenschildt and in New Orleans with Guy Bannister, David Ferry, and the late Clay Shaw. This is an important piece of work because, and it was supported later by the House committee work, that Oswald was not acting out on a limb someplace as a deranged communist, that he had ties to anti-communists. Thirdly, Mr. Garrison at the trial showed very clearly by the testimony of Colonel Fink that at the Bethesda autopsy, Colonel Fink and the other 2 doctors were not allowed to track the trace of the neck wound in President Kennedy. They were told not to track that by military superior officers that were in the room with them. This is a significant piece of testimony because it obviously violates the rules of a basic homicide investigation. Additionally, through Jim Garrison's work, we know from the Gemberling document and the reports of the FBI that there was a shallow wound found in President Kennedy's back, 6 inches below the shoulder blade. That shallow wound, in its essence, defeats the possibility of a magic bullet going through the back and coming out the throat. That, among other things, is some of the work that Garrison has contributed.
What information did you have available to you? Were you just dealing with press releases or testimony from Mr. Garrison, or what type of information did you have, and was it based on factual material?
We based our movie on Mr. Garrison's book On the Trail of the Assassins, which details his investigation and the problems he had. As you know, he was for open government back then in 1967 through 9. He subpoenaed Allen Dulles, ex-chief of the CIA, and Charles Cabell, Richard Bissell. Those subpoenas were squashed once again by the Justice Department. Mr. Garrison tried to run a trial in the light of day. His office was bugged. He was bribed. The media essentially made him, I think, into a non-person and ridiculed him, and he has suffered from that libel for more than 20 years. We based part of the movie on the book by Jim Morris called Crossfire, which is a compendium basically of the research done by private individuals, people without money, who formed over a course of years a small network of 12 to 20 people who communicated with each other, starting with people like Sylvia Marr, who wrote the book Accessories After the Fact, which examined in detail the Warren Commission contradictions. And it was this small network of private researchers that I believe have done the most serious and progressive work in the assassination, whereas I feel that government bodies, from the Warren Commission on down, have stagnated in their investigation into this area. We also based the film in part on Warren Commission sources and public sources that we could find, including living witnesses who came to our attention, people who were in Dallas that day, people who sent us letters, people who talked to us. We did our homework conscientiously. Of course, we were at one point, we could not go further than we could because many of these files, as you know, were sealed to the American public in the 1960s and were never opened, and the Warren Commission information was always compromised by the fact that the CIA, the FBI, military intelligence never gave any significant information to the Warren Commission members. And in fact, the Warren Commission was chaired, one of the members of the Warren Commission was Allen Dulles, who had been fired by President Kennedy as the chief of the CIA. There seems to be the element of the fox investigating the chicken coop here. Among some of the records that we were dying to get hold of in order to elaborate on our theories in the film are the testimony to the House Committee of people like Santos Traficante, Richard Case Nagel, William Sullivan, who was the chief of covert operations in the FBI, Atlee Phillips, who was a CIA agent, Delphine Roberts, the secretary to Guy Bannister, Marina Oswald, Wally Weston, George de Mohrenschildt, who testified, Dean Andrews, William Walter, the Dallas doctors, the Bethesda doctors. We have more than 43 hours of Cuban exiled interviews that were done that we don't have access to. 47 hours of something called JFK hearings. We don't know what's in those 47 hours. Frank Sturgis, Joseph Miltier, still living, Richard Helms, Admiral Berkeley, H.L. Hunt, CIA agent at that time, Warren DeBreeze, an FBI agent in New Orleans at that time who knew Oswald very well, who is still living, Robert Webster, another defector who defected to the Soviet Union and returned a month before Oswald to this country, a pattern similar to Oswald's, Ruth Payne, who knew the Oswalds very well in Dallas.
All these names that you're mentioning, the ones that are living, did you contact them, or
no? None of these people would talk to us.
Would the gentleman yield
Yes.
to me? First of all, I see Professor Blakey is back in the room, and I want to apologize to him and tell him that on reconsideration of the statement that he submitted, it will be accepted into the record. And then I'd like to ask Mr. Stone this question, sir. What is your theory of the John F. Kennedy assassination?
Contrary to the many misrepresentations you've read in the press, that I have postulated some massive conspiracy where 4,000 people get together at a convention in Miami Beach and call for the murder of the president. If you look at the film closely, which is quite possible now that the video cassette is coming out and you can have a second viewing in your home and pause and stop and actually listen to what people are saying, you will find that there are essentially two conspiracies are hypothecated. The first one, a conspiracy to kill the president, which is very small and covert in nature. I can see as little as 5 to 10 people being involved in it. I think it was done in a very sophisticated manner, where people who, if they are living, would not even know the names of the people that gave them the orders to do it. I think it had to come from an element in government that was practiced in this art of assassination. The only people with that sort of experience are obviously the intelligence agencies who had been doing it abroad in the 1950s and in the early 60s. I think that expertise was brought home into America, and I think that we should look closer at the Operation Mongoose, because that was essentially a paramilitary unit in these shores, run by Colonel Lansdale, or General Lansdale, and in it we have all the realistic equipment, manpower with which to accomplish something of this scope. We should look, the House and the Senate should look at the Operation Mongoose files. It should be open. There's a second conspiracy I hypothecate, and that is the conspiracy to cover it up. And that cover-up, I believe, has been going on for 28 years, and most recently expressed itself in the vehement attacks and misrepresentations on my film. That cover-up, I believe, involved people like Lyndon Johnson. I think the appointment of the Warren Commission was a means by which to derail a serious homicide investigation, which was never accomplished. A trial should have been held in Texas. The body should have been examined in Texas by, and as we know, the Bethesda autopsy through the investigation of James Garrison, we know that autopsy was a compromised, if not a rigged affair. The cover-up extends, I believe, to the FBI and Mr. Hoover, at that time chairman of the FBI. Mr. Hoover's, let's say, to use a euphemism, open dislike for the Kennedys. And I think it extends to people in the Warren Commission, such as Allen Dulles, whose motives, I think, are subject to scrutiny. But I don't think necessarily that the people involved in the cover-up were people involved in the conspiracy to kill him. What I did in the movie was show a paradigm of possibilities. I showed a president that deeply divided the country, made many enemies through policies against, intended to end the Cold War. His American University speech, I think, is an eloquent testimony by an American president to ending the Cold War. Signing the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was a major breakthrough. Backdoor negotiations with Fidel Castro, a warming relationship with the Premier Khrushchev of Russia, a strict no-combat policy in Laos and in Vietnam, a no-combat policy in Cuba on 2 occasions, Bay of Pigs and prior to the missile crisis of October '62. I think we have a president that was moving on many fronts to rock the boat, to shake the establishment. And I think we must look there for the root causes of people who were, if not involved in assassinating the president, were certainly relieved to see him go. I had one slight misstatement I would like to correct. I said H.L. Hunt when I meant Howard Hunt. H.L. Hunt is a private citizen. Howard Hunt was a government employee. He was a CIA agent who was involved, as you know, with Watergate. So
we had both of them before the committee, so... But at any rate,
yes.
Would you give me your impression or your thoughts as to the possible involvement of either of the conspiracy theories on the part of the late Chief Justice Earl Warren?
No, sir, I do not believe that Justice Warren was involved in either conspiracy. I do believe that an inordinate amount of pressure was brought to bear on Justice Warren to take this job. By accounts of the journalists that knew him during this period, he was an older man and partially senile. There is a written account of President Johnson's meeting with him where President Johnson used the terminology of, if you don't take this kind of job, we are looking at a situation where World War III is possible. 40 million lives are at stake. Earl Warren did not want it. I gather that President Johnson pressured him. My particular belief, if you care to know it, is that President Johnson said something of this nature to Earl Warren. He said, look, Oswald extends to Cuba. This thing goes to Cuba. If the American people find this out, they're going to want to invade Cuba, or they're going to want to take some kind of vengeance on Fidel Castro. If that happens, the Russians are going to come in, and we're going to be on another World War III situation, as we were 11 months ago at during the October missile crisis. The American people were tired of the possibility of war, scared of it. It was better to keep this in the closet and find Oswald to be the lone assassin and let the story end there. And I think that President Johnson not only told this to Justice Warren, I think he used this very palpable excuse in talking not only to Justice Warren, but to the major newspapers of the time. Because there was an appalling lack of investigation on the part of New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, and Newsweek Magazine, and CBS News and NBC News to investigate this matter.
Did you attempt to get some of the material that you referred to earlier that was held by the administration or some of the agencies of the administration?
We have used the services of the archive. The name escapes me, but basically Kevin Walsh is running the
archives.
What's it called? The Assassination Archives here in Washington. They've been trying for years with Freedom of Information Acts to get information out. We used a lot of their work because obviously to make a movie we had a year's time span, and in order to get Freedom of Information documents it takes a lot longer. We used also a lot of private researchers have demanded this information. We used their information that they had. But we have not been able to talk to the people that I mentioned before. They do not want to talk to us. Obviously, I feel strongly that an inquiry should be made on these living people, and they should be questioned.
Did you attempt to talk to former President Gerald Ford before you made the movie?
I think Gerald Ford has spoken very clearly about where he stands. He's written about it. As you know, he released a book even before, he released an article even before the Warren Commission was made public, setting the tone of a lone gunman. President Ford's been very outspoken in the defense of the lone gunman theory, and I believe he's made public everything he knows.
But did you attempt to speak?
No, sir, we did not.
I guess my first question is, do you feel there would be many national security issues or privacy issues that would involve the withholding of much information? I guess my concern is, do you have concern that one of the means by which some information will be withheld would be that it would in fact embarrass individuals who are involved in the process of doing investigative work? That, in other words, they maybe should have done more, and that they could in fact be embarrassed by what might come out, and therefore they should be entitled to privacy.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that the House investigation, as well-intentioned as it was, became a political football. Richard Sprague was removed. Mr. Blakey came in. Mr. Blakey has written books about his opinion on the assassination, tracing it back to the mafia. We've had a public debate on, we've had debates about this on television, but as you know, I find that the mafia theory has been one of the great red herrings in this case, and is once you get past the single gunman theory and you get into the area of conspiracy, as we know from the Frank Church hearings, the CIA has always used the organizations like the mafia as a area for plausible deniability. And I think that we've run into that aspect of the case, and you're going to hear more of it as these hearings go along. And if we ever open these files, you're going to hear a lot of mafia stories. But we must always look past the mafia to who pulls the strings, who is more powerful. And we must look again at Frank Church's work and Richard Schweiker's work, and look at the connection between the intelligence agencies of our country and the mafia, because that is at the root of this problem. I think that the privacy considerations of individuals are far outweighed by the importance of this murder and what it means for America. Questions such as, do we really have a democracy? Is the government truly accountable to the American public? Can the government just make records known when they want to the American public? These are fundamental questions, and it goes right up to today's problems with the many conspiracies that have surfaced in the 1970s and the 1980s. The American people feel that fear that government may once again thumb its nose at them by filtering this legislation through many oversight committees and much bureaucratic red tape.
But my question is, if you had had access to greater information and the information had suggested other directions, would you have sought to go in those directions, or were you pretty much focused on the theories that you presented?
No, sir. As I went along, I learned quite a bit. This was a process that took almost 2 years of research and reading, and information was coming into us at all times. I cannot tell you the amount of people that approached me in dark alleys or through phone calls and gave me information. I never even saw the linkages to President Kennedy and the origins of the Vietnam War when I started this movie. The NSAM 263 and 273 came to my attention through the historian's work, John Newman's work on JFK and Vietnam.
So when you started out making this movie and you learned more about it, did some of the conclusions in the movie change? Some of the directions change based on information that came to you?
Absolutely. Colonel Fletcher Prouty, who was a patriot and worked in our government for 30 years, who resigned in 1964, added a substantial amount of information that I was not aware of and is not in Jim Garrison's book. Also, Jim Garrison did not have the benefit of a lot of this information we got in the 1970s and 1980s. What I find interesting in the assassination is that, as far as the American public is concerned, with the 500 books that have been written about it, the information has come to us in fragmentary manner through the years. We have a piece of information in 1968, another piece that emerges in 73, 75, 78. I think the movie performed a service by putting together into one mosaic all the best information we have to contradict the Warren Commission. And that was never available to the American people until this movie.
I guess I just conclude by making this comment. It's just, to me, illustrates another reason why it's unfortunate this information wasn't available, because I'm sure that if you had had access to information that is now not disclosed, that you would have been able to provide other information that would have been helpful and interesting.
Well, I think you could also argue that if the information had been made public in 1968 and 5 and 6, that movies would have been made in 1969, because it would have been an explosive revelation. we wouldn't have had to wait 28 years to make this movie.
When you were trying to be as honest in your movie as you possibly could, did you have a process of evaluating those people that came forth with information?
Sir, I evaluated everything, and I think in every case I always had a second source for every fact as stated in the movie. Where I speculated, the characters, if you watch it closely, say maybe, what if, let's speculate, shall we? I use that kind of dialogue, that kind of language. I also I'm sure you know that when the assassination occurred, many people in Europe and all over the world doubted the cover story that was put out that afternoon. By 5:30, the press had us believe that Lee Oswald gave us the complete profile of Lee Oswald before he was even charged with the murder of the president. At 5:30, he was charged at 12:30 that night. At 5:30, a profile of him as a lone nut, deranged communist was in the press, and it was worldwide. Colonel Fletcher Prouty read about it in New Zealand. I'm sure if you were in Ethiopia or Germany, you read the same story. It was a wire story. Colonel Prouty confirmed to me many of these suspicions, that this was a black operation. It was run by intelligence, and Colonel Prouty has a long and distinguished record in our government, and he knew people like Allen Dulles, and he was, I think, a very strong second source to people like Jim Garrison and Jim Mars in his book Crossfire. We threw out a lot of information that was spectacular and sensational out of the movie. I think we could have created even more fireworks. We could have gone one step further. There is much evidence to pointing to the fact that Lyndon Johnson made a phone call to the chief of police of the Dallas, Will Fritz, to tell him that he had his man. We now know from Charles Crenshaw's revelations, #1 bestseller this week, he was a doctor at Parkland Hospital, that President Johnson called when Oswald was on the table, dying, and asked if the last rites could be attained, a confession could be obtained from Oswald. Many of this information was available to us, but we did not use it because of its sensationalistic nature. We tried to be responsible, and we tried to get second sources on everything we had in the movie.
Mr. Stone, if this material is released, and I hope it is, do you intend to make another movie?
I would hate to have to be in a position where I would have to make a film called MLK to get released the files on Martin Luther King, which, as you know, is also part of the HSCA files. The 850 boxes, I believe, contain much of the Martin Luther King material, and I think it should be similarly unsealed. There are certainly even fewer national security considerations involved, and no possible foreign policy consequences in the Martin Luther King case. I realize it might be distracting to seek to amend House Joint Resolution 454 to include the...
Let's don't include that in this one. I mean, we really, I have no problem with moving forward on that, but I really think that for us to try to do that would confuse the issue and create some real serious problems.
Although I think it would be good if some kind of oversight mechanism could be established in the legislature, that cases could be looked at in the future, such as the Martin Luther King case, the Robert Kennedy case, the Richard Nixon Watergate case, because these are all part, I think, of a overriding and similar syndrome that has afflicted American politics since World War II. And I would urge the committee to think seriously about our history and what has been told to the American people, and to try to approach the type of glasnost that we've seen in the last few years in Eastern Europe.
We're indebted to you, and I can say this on behalf of the entire committee, that we appreciate your contribution to our country's attempt to become more open, not just in your artistic work, but in your very thoughtful presentation here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very
sir.
much.
Thank you.